first Easter. How many of you came because you saw the advertisement in the Spotlight? A couple of people. How many came because you saw it in the library web page? A couple of people. How many of you came because a friend told you about it or somebody told you about it? Okay. And why did you come? Anybody want to say, you know, what they were hoping to find out, what they're hoping to learn, why they might have come? Anybody? Sure.
A better defense for the gospel.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I'm sure you'll have questions down the road. You all have a 3x5 card so that those of you who don't feel that comfortable asking a question in public can write down a question. You can hand them up, and I'll try to answer all the questions that you have at the end. It'll be about an hour and a half that we'll go, and then I'll answer questions. So, what really happened that first Easter? How would you answer this question? When you ask a question, I did research in the sciences, and then I was a psychologist. I studied and got my PhD. If you're going to ask a question, you have to think about how are you going to answer that question? What kind of tests, what kind of information you need to answer a question like that? Well, unfortunately, a lot of people answer a question like this various different ways that don't really work. So here's the top 10 ways people answer this question. Number 10, check with top scientists, ask their opinion. Number 9, get a majority vote. I think Jesus said it. Oh, do you? No. Number 8, take a philosophy class and deduce it from pure logic. Just sit in your chair and think logically, can you figure this out? Number 7, see how I feel about it. Number 6, read the Bible and see if you get a burning in the bosom. Then you'll know it's true, right? Number 5, my culture says it's true, so it must be. It's traditional, so it must be true. Or it's how I grew up. Well, if you grow up in India, then you get one answer. If you grow up in America, you get another. So that's not going to work too well. Number 4, my parents said. Or maybe my parents were jerks, so it's whatever they didn't say. Number 3, try it out. See if you like it. Number 2, because the cool guy in the shaved head and the orange robe said it. What's the number 1? Can you guess what number 1 might be? Anybody guess?
Jesus rose from the dead.
Jesus rose from the dead. How would you answer a question like, did he rise from the dead? How would you answer the question? Anybody else?
Harry says it.
Harry says it. I just made it up myself. It's a personal belief, isn't it, anyway? So these are the top 10 ways you really don't want to answer a question that's really important. But unfortunately, this is the way that most people will come to an answer about questions of life and death and afterlife and why am I here and what's my purpose, where did I come from, where am I going? What we're going to do is we're asking the question, is this even a legitimate question? If you go to a university, you might have the question raised, is it really even legitimate? Because aren't resurrections, or any miracles for that matter, by definition impossible? Because don't they violate the established laws of science? Aren't they in the realm of religion? They're not really in the realm of fact and science. So a miracle, that's something that naturally doesn't happen, so therefore it's not really a question that you can really ask that way. Well, David Hume in the 1700s was the person who really kind of coined this, and a lot of people kind of picked up on this, that miracles can happen because, and here's what he says, nothing's a miracle if a man dies all of a sudden. It's rare, but sometimes it happens, so it's not a miracle. But it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country. So it's a miracle because it doesn't happen. Well, a logical fallacy we have to discuss. There's a whole bunch of logical fallacies that I've gone into when I do workshops, maybe 20 of them that people make. But a logical fallacy is an element of an argument that's flawed, and it essentially renders the line of reasoning incorrect or wrong, if not the entire argument is invalid. So one example of a logical fallacy is circular reasoning. So you have a premise, it states the conclusion, and the conclusion actually proves the premise, which proves the conclusion, and goes around in a circle. So here's an example of it. Hume's is really an example of that. And if you see the movie God's Not Dead, the protagonist actually comes and discusses how there's a circular reasoning in this argument about miracles. Because unanimous observations determine the laws of nature. Basically, the dead stay dead. Well, if you have people that are claiming they've observed somebody who was alive after he was dead, Jesus rising, well, it can't be true because of A, you've already got unanimous observations. So some other explanation has to be had for that. The problem with this is the observations can't be unanimous if you have people at some place in time are observing some exception to the rule. So here's another example of circular reasoning. The Bible is the Word of God. The Bible says Jesus is God. Jesus says the Bible's inerrant, so therefore the Bible is the Word of God. So, and the Bible says Jesus is God. So round in a circle it goes. You can't start with the Bible is the Word of God, and so it's saying Jesus is God, and the Bible is the Word of God because Jesus and the Bible says the Word is God. It's arguing in a circle. Another example would be miracles don't happen by definition, so therefore any miracles you see, not just resurrections, any kind of miracles, they can't possibly have happened. There has to be another explanation. Either they're added to the text later or they weren't really meant to be literal. So you probably heard those. So therefore the premise is true that miracles can't happen, so you have to find some other explanation. Well, you started with the premise that miracles can't happen. Well, what are you going to end up with? You're always going to end up with that same thing. You're precluding even discovering a miracle if it happens. So don't be like the old farmer who all he saw on his farm was pigs and, goats and sheep. And somebody told him about a giraffe, and he says, nah, there ain't so much an animal like that with a long neck and spots. Ain't no such animal. Take the old farmer to the zoo, show him a giraffe, and he says, ain't no such animal. So if you've got some evidence, you're either gonna look and go by the evidence, or you're going to stay with your opinion. No, it couldn't happen. I can't possibly believe it. But don't be like the farmer. Be open to evidence. In a big universe that's contingent, that means it's dependent. One thing's dependent on another, and it's huge, and there's a chain of events that goes on and on. You can't say what's possible and impossible unless you check under every rock in the entire universe for all time. Then you can say determinatively, this cannot happen. But you can't say what's possible and impossible unless you have all knowledge of all places at all times. So, are you an open-minded agnostic? I don't know, but I'm willing to look at some evidence if somebody has some. That's what I was. When I started college, I was basically an agnostic, maybe more like an atheist. People would say, well, I said, how do you know? Why do you believe Jesus rose from the dead? They would tell me, you have to have faith. I said, why do I have to have faith? And they couldn't give me an answer. I got really irritated with them. I didn't want to have, don't bother me with any, wishy-washy thinking. So I became a hardcore skeptic. But I was an open-minded skeptic, so that if somebody had some evidence, I'd be interested. Nobody seemed to have any. Then somebody presented me with, said, you got to check this out. This lawyer's going to be speaking, see what he has to say. And I was open to look at it. So I was open, and actually then I changed my mind when I saw that there was evidence. So, or are you a closed-minded agnostic? That's what I call somebody who doesn't know if this is true or not, but they know that you can't know. Anybody that says they know, they're lying, they can't know. Nobody could know. So you're closed-minded, even if they have evidence, I'm not going to listen to it. So don't be like that. I say, show me the money, show me the facts. So that's what we're going to do tonight. There's only two facts to establish: alive at time A and dead at time B. Whoops. The only difference, so those are not really difficult facts to establish. Those are the only two facts we have to establish. That the person, whoever we're talking about, in this case Jesus, was alive at time A and dead at time B. The only difference between regular life, like if somebody asked me tomorrow and said, is Frank Ray alive on April 16th at 5:50 p.m.? I would say yes. And they say, how do you know? Because I saw him, I talked to him, I shook hands with him, I watched him he's chewing gum or something, I watched him chew something. I'd say, yeah, he's alive. That's not that hard to determine. And if you say, is somebody dead? Well, the coroner, buried him. He was at the morgue, he put in the ground buried, he's certainly dead. So those are not really difficult things to establish. The only difference is that with a resurrection, B comes before A. That's the only difference. Not observation. It doesn't, these really technical questions. They require special powers of observation. You really have to be trained. Or do they require specific scientific equipment? Is it like, wow, I don't know if I saw that or not? No, they're not those kind of questions. They're pretty standard questions that the janitor could answer or the president, things that we're very familiar with all the time. So, but those are the two facts that we have to establish. So the method. The methods, we said that we don't want to use the top 10, but here's the methods we're going to use. The basic approach. If something works for everything else, if it works for buying a car, if it works for determining if Caesar crossed the Rubicon, if it works for determining if Abraham was shot in Ford's Theater, then it's going to work for religious questions. If it doesn't work for anywhere else, it won't work for religion either. So we're not going to use it. Unfortunately, people get into a lot of trouble because if you see the History Channel, sometimes they'll say, well, gee whiz, maybe this document, it looks like it was written by a Gospel of Thomas, Apocrypha, or something like that. Well, if you apply the same techniques that you would for any other writing or any other testimony, other document, it's not going to hold up. So why are you going to speculate in a different way about something religious? I say we're going to use the same tests you use for everything else. So now, sometimes people get into question, what is faith? What is faith? I say faith is something that everybody uses all the time. It's not like, here's religion and faith, and here's science and facts. Because we operate by faith every day. You sat down in your chair. You saw the chair, you saw it's a solid structure. It's probably the engineer knew what he was doing designing it. Probably the people who built it knew what they were doing. And the probability is high that chair is going to hold your weight, and you sat down in it. Sat down on the table. You guys all sat down on the table, in the chair. However, your observations, your eyes could not be working right. You could have missed something. Maybe the chair has a screw loose in it, whatever. And you have a high probability, you're deciding there's a high probability that chair is going to hold my weight. But you never have 100 absolute %. Anything in the real world, you don't have that. But nevertheless, what faith is, it jumps that gap between the high probability in the real world, which is everything we have, and a commitment, a personal commitment. So walk across in the street. Here's a lady with her little children. She looks both ways, sees no cars are coming. And what does she do? She's relying on her powers of observation, which are never 100% absolutely accurate. We're human, we err. But you're reaching a high level of probability. Then what does she do? She doesn't take 99.99% of herself across the street. She takes 100% of herself. And she takes her 100% of her little kids, which I'm sure she loves her little kids. She doesn't want to put them at risk. But she's still making 100% commitment. So what faith is from that 99% probability, okay, I believe it's safe to cross the street. I'm making a personal commitment of 100% of myself. That's what faith is. So there's actually 3 types of claims. The philosophers, analytic philosophers, which I like analytical philosophers, they kind of delineate 3 different types of claims. And one is absolute. So sometimes people are asking for absolute 100% certainty in religious areas of life that they never ask for or could ask for in any real area of life. That's absolute certainty is only true in areas of mathematics. It's definitional and logic. So for example, if I say that A is not B, then A cannot be B. That would be logically contradictory. Something can't be the same thing in the same place at the same time and not be the same thing in the same place at the same time. And the same thing with mathematics, it's definitional. If you say 1 and you define what 2 is, you define what plus is, you define what equals is, then 1 plus 1 equals 2. 100% certain it's always that way because you've defined it that way. But if you're going to deal in the realm of the real world, you have to deal with facts. And facts are never 100%. If I say there's 60 people in the room, that's a question of fact. What you have to do is you observe and you count the people and you see if there's 60 people in the room. And you can't be absolutely 100% absolute that there's 60 people. Maybe you missed one, maybe you miscounted. It's based on our powers of observation, our 5 senses, which are never absolutely 100% certain. Science, law, history, decisions you make every day, they're factual questions. They're never absolutely certain. So somebody saying, I'm not going to believe this until it's absolutely certain is not really a fair way to look at it. You'll never get a real answer in the real world. The third type of statement or claim is, they call it a wasteback category or a nonsensical category because it's not true, it's not even really false. It's something that it's not true or false, that you can't prove it or disprove it. Wolfgang Pauling, who is a famous physicist, wrote in a colleague's paper who was writing about some physical phenomena. He wrote in the column of the paper, he said, this isn't true. This isn't even false. There's something worse than true or false. It's like it can't be proven or disproven. This is the type of claim I'm demonstrate that. The toasted cheese deity. I believe in a toasted cheese deity. And he lives on a planet out there. It's just beyond the most powerful telescope on Earth. You can't see him out there, but he's out there. You can imagine what kind of a sacrament he uses, and he doesn't really like hamburgers, so don't eat hamburgers or you'll be in trouble. But and he's got this whole system out there, and you say, well, how do you know that? Well, you know what? He's definitely out there. There's this planet. There he is. So, well, we build a bigger telescope. We get the Hubble telescopes, put it out there. Now we can look even further. We're going to look for him out there. Up. No, every time you build a bigger telescope, he moves with his planet. He moves it out further so you can't see him. So no matter how big your telescope is, he's really sneaky. He always moves it further out. So you could never disprove him. You can never prove him. That's a nonsensical claim. A lot of religions and a lot of religious claims are that way. They're not really based on anything. You couldn't disprove it. You couldn't prove it. As a matter of fact, I was just reading today about Buddhism, why you should be a Buddhist and stuff. And the people were explaining, they were saying, well, it's really not a religion. We're really not making a particular claim. It's just something you try it and it feels good and you like it. But we're not making any particular claims. Well, so you can't disprove it, you can't prove it. The resurrection, however, is a factual question. So, did this happen historically or did it not? And the Apostle Paul said, if Christ is not risen from the dead, we're of all men most miserable, and we might as well eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die. We're kind of fools for following it, and we're dummies and we're stupid, basically he's saying. It's all based on the resurrection. If it happened, then absolutely we're going to follow. But if it didn't happen, this whole thing is a hoax and it's worthless. So it's not a philosophical question. So people argue in a philosophy class and all this. It's not a philosophical question. It's a factual question. So to answer a factual question, you need to use scientific, forensic, historic, legal methods. And what are these methods? So we're going to look at these. So you're thinking of mixing things. It's not scientific. But see, science is based also on observation. Scientists make observations and they report their observations. And they might test their observations. And how do you know that the Earth is warming or that it's cooling? You're relying on somebody made observations 50 years ago and looked at temperatures and now looking at temperatures now. And that's science. But you're relying on people who observed, eyewitnesses, and it's not 100% certain, but it's a factual question. So same as historical questions like Jesus rose from the dead or he's still dead. That's a historical, factual question, and that's based on observations by people, observation, just like scientists would make observations. Same thing. This is a list of people I'll tell you a little bit about, maybe some of them later, but these are people who just examined the evidence. They were skeptics, they didn't believe it, and they were challenged. They looked at the evidence and they became believers just based on the evidence alone. C.S. Lewis, you might recognize, Narnia Chronicles. He actually, at an older age, I think he was in his late 30s, he said he was brought kicking and screaming, really, by the evidence. He didn't really want to believe it, but it was like he was confronted with it, and he said, how can I deny it? So here's the evidence outside the Bible we're going to start with. Now, this evidence isn't really the strongest because all this evidence outside the Bible is not eyewitness testimony. All the eyewitness testimony was actually collected. It's 27 books in the New Testament. Those are all eyewitnesses or close associates of eyewitnesses. So anything that's outside the Bible, by definition, is something that people understood really didn't come from eyewitnesses. It comes from other people that were not eyewitnesses. Like, it would be hearsay, it would be secondary explanations, but nevertheless, it's useful to look at it. So these are non-Christians. These are not people that believe in Jesus. This is Josephus. He's a Jewish historian, you can see, 37 to 100 AD. He wrote History of the Jews, a big 1,200-page tome about the whole history of the Jews. But he says in there, James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. So you can't say that all these stories were made up later, that Jesus was called the Christ and everything, because here's Josephus already saying that this is what people are saying about, and this is what is true about him. And some people argue about the versions, but that some versions were added to and changed by Christians. But this Arabic version is very improbable that that one was doctored, discovered in the 10th century. And he says in there that at this time there was a wise man, so he calls him wise, Jesus. His conduct was good and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate, see there's a confirmation of Pilate, condemned him to be crucified and to die. There he's talking about crucifixion and that he died. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion. All right. 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive accordingly he was perhaps the Messiah. Josephus didn't really believe he was the Messiah, but he's saying, perhaps, I don't know, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So that's one external. Here's another one. Thallus was 52 AD. He's a Greek historian. He's obviously over in Greece, so he's not in Palestine. So he's reporting secondary things that he hears. But he says, on the whole world there pressed a fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. So he's talking about when Jesus Christ was crucified, when he died, there's an earthquake and there's a darkness, confirming what the gospel accounts say. So here's Lucius. He's a Greek satirist and cynic. He made fun of Christians. He thought they were a joke. 160 AD, he's saying the poor fools have persuaded themselves above all that they are immortal and will live forever, from which it follows that they despise death, and many of them willingly undergo imprisonment. Moreover, their first lawgiver taught them that they are all brothers of one another. When once they have sinned, denying the Greek gods, worshiping that crucified, so they're saying the evidence, they all know that he was crucified. Sophist, which is a nasty term, just saying he's just puffed up talking about things. Himself and living according to his laws. So they despise all things equally and regard them as common property, accepting such teaching without any sort of clear proof. Accordingly, if any quack or trickster who can press his advantage comes among them, he can acquire great wealth in a very short time by imposing on these simple-minded people. So obviously he's not a Christian. He doesn't really think a lot of them, but he's confirming certain events. So here's a summary by a guy, Michael Gleghorn. He just summarizes a few of the extra biblical references. So we see Josephus and Lucian, which we just saw, indicate that he was wise, Pliny, and the Talmud. The Talmud is a commentary basically on the Old Testament by the Jews. They don't believe in the Messiah, but they're Jews. And Lucian, they all imply that he was a powerful and revered teacher. Josephus and the Talmud indicate he performed miraculous feats. Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, certainly not interested in promoting Christianity. Josephus, the Jewish historian, and the Talmud. and Lucian all mention that he was crucified. So if you think, oh, well, it didn't really happen, I don't know if this guy really existed, maybe they crucified the wrong guy, et cetera, et cetera. Even outside the Bible, you have people confirming those things. Tacitus, Josephus, and the Talmud, and Lucian, they all mention that he was crucified. So Tacitus and Josephus say this occurred under Pontius Pilate. And the Talmud declares that it happened on the eve of the Passover, which, by the way, was the full moon you guys all saw. That was Passover, right? So, and the Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection, Tacitus and Josephus, they both say that Christians believed in his resurrection. So this is not some later story, hundreds of years later, because here Tacitus and Josephus, which you see lived in 30 to 120 AD, when there's probably still people around that he could have interviewed, he knows they believed in the resurrection. It's a story made up later. Josephus records that followers believed he was Christ, the Messiah, and Pliny and Lucian indicate that Christians worship Jesus as God. So people saying, oh, no, there's a later thing, they said that. You can't support that from even people who don't believe. So, but the most powerful and fundamental evidence is what? If you're going to establish a fact from history, what's the most powerful evidence? Eyewitness. You're right. Eyewitness accounts. There's nothing better than that. And in a courtroom, in a court of law, and actually back even in the Old Testament, let everything be established by two or more witnesses. So eyewitnesses really are the best. You can have circumstantial evidence, there was a bloody knife in the room and different things, but if you have eyewitness, and if you have two eyewitnesses, you got a powerful case. So here's what we're going to do. These are the testable hypotheses that we're going to make, and we're going to see if they hold up. First is the documents are reliable. If you don't have reliable documents, then you're dead in the water. I mean, how can you know anything about what happened? They contain eyewitness testimony. The documents could be reliable, but the people who are writing them, they might not be eyewitnesses. They might be secondary sources. They might not be qualified to actually talk about the events. And by the way, all those non-Christian people I mentioned, none of those are eyewitnesses. So they're not as powerful as if we find these are eyewitnesses. The testimony observes Jesus' claims to be the Messiah. So we're going to see if that's really true. That's a testable hypothesis. Do they describe him saying that? And number 4, Jesus proves it by rising from the dead. Again, what we got to prove is that they observed him alive at point A, dead at point B, and really alive at point C. So we're going to test all these hypotheses and see if they hold up. Are the documents reliable? Now, I often like to ask people, because they say, oh, it was written 2,000 years ago. We don't really know much about it, and I don't know, and I don't know if it happened. I say, well, how would you determine that? How do you determine if something happened in history? What kind of methods or tests would you use? I have never had anybody respond to me and tell me, and be able to tell me they're like a deer caught in the headlights. They don't think about that. They just, I read it on the back of a Rice Krispies box. I saw it on the TV. I heard somebody talking about it, but, well, how do you know? And so how can you reject something if you haven't even, examined it or checked it out? You don't even know what test you're going to use. So here I'm going to tell you what historians use, the tests they use, to determine if documents are reliable. Again, we're saying if it works in the secular world, everything else will work for religion. Doesn't work in the secular world, it ain't going to work for religion. So you get a bunch of people in a room and they vote whether Jesus said that or not. It's not going to work because you don't get everybody in the room and vote whether Caesar said that or not. You don't use a totally different method, a historical method. Here's number 1, the number of manuscript copies. The more you have, the more sure you can be you know what the original was and what it said. If you have 1 copy of a document, then you can't be as certain if you have 1,000 copies and they all are the same and they match, and you say, well, we got 1,000 copies and they're all pretty much the same. We can be pretty certain that's what the document was. If you only have 1, then you don't have as much evidence. Number 2, years between the date written and the earliest surviving copy. If you've got a long time before the earliest copy you have, then you're less certain than if you have a very short time. So if somebody wrote something in 50 AD and all the documents, because they're written on paper, they're written with papyrus, they're written on animal skins, they deteriorate over time. So you expect most things to kind of be gone and deteriorate. But if you have only something from 1000 AD, and all the other ones have disappeared and deteriorated and are gone, you only have the 1000 AD one of somebody who was writing in 50 AD. You got a long time span, and it's not as, it's not as reliable as if you have something, another document that, like, you have copies of things that go back like to 200 AD or something. External evidence. Is there any external evidence for authorship? And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Is somebody else saying, hey, I know this guy, he wrote this book, I know he was an eyewitness, whatever. Is there external evidence? And the fourth one is internal evidence. Do the documents themselves say, I was there, I'm reporting facts to you, I was an eyewitness? And is it internally, does it have the flavor of eyewitness testimony? And there's other things that I'm going to show you in the documents. There's internal tests that you use. If you doubt, the benefit of the doubt goes to the writer. You don't say, hey, I've got a copy of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. He's writing about what happened between the Greeks and the Spartans. And somebody says, hey, I don't know, that might have been written by somebody else. And you say, hey, why? You say, I don't know, but I just think it might have been written by somebody else. If it says it's written by Thucydides, you go with it's written by Thucydides. And you give the benefit of the doubt to the writer. Otherwise, you're doubting everything. Gee, did Dr. Perry Sherman really, put that flyer out? It has his name on it. But did he really? Oh, I don't know if he did. You're just not going to get anywhere with anything if you're doubting everything that you have. The benefit of that doubt goes to the writer, unless there's evidence to the contrary. So here's a number of manuscripts. The first test. For all other documents in the ancient world, you have Caesar's history of his Gallic Wars. You got 10 copies. Thucydides, which I just talked about, you have 8 copies. Herodotus, a Greek historian, you have 8, etc. down the line. For the New Testament documents, you have almost 25,000. My stepdaughter Ashley said, well, you got to make the scale different because you can't see anything over here. Well, that's the point. It's so minuscule compared to the evidence for the New Testament documents. I mean, there's nothing even on the planet close to it. And by the way, when I was an undergrad at Case, I studied the classics, and we would read Thucydides and we'd read Herodotus, and it was like, there's no doubt that's about historical stuff. It's accurate. Not a bat an eye. I didn't really know that there were only 8 copies existing. There were only 8. I didn't know that, but they didn't have any problem with it. Of course, you walk over to the religion studies departments, and they're saying, well, we don't know what really happened, blah, blah, blah. Why don't you talk to the classics department, Here's the time between writing and the earliest surviving manuscript, the second test. So there's Thucydides, look at that, 1,300 years. Nobody told me that. The earliest copy is like, I don't know, 900 or 1,000, I'll show you in the next chart, and it's 1,300 years after when actually Thucydides wrote it. That's the earliest surviving copy we have. We've got Caesar, you got 1,000 years. The best one, the Iliad, there's 400 years later is the earliest copy of the Iliad. The Iliad's kind of a story, and it's got fantastic things in this stuff. It's not quite exactly meant to be, it's an exact history, but Livy is writing about the Roman Empire, the history of Rome and stuff. He's writing about that. He's the closest one that's a historian, and he's 400 years later is his earliest copy. And that's only actually a partial copy. The New Testament, you're like within 30, 40, 50 years. I'm going to show you that. So it blows everything else away. Here's some details. We don't have to get into all the details, but there you see Homer, written 800 BC. The earliest copy we have is 400 BC, 400 years. We got 643 of those. There's old Thucydides, 460 to 400 BC. The earliest copy is 900 AD, and we only have 8 copies. So you can see on there, you can see the different ones. The New Testament, on the other hand, written, say, 50 AD to 100 AD. All the books were written in that time period, and because the people lived during that time period. And you see, you've got and everything I'm going to show from here on out, everything about the New Testament documents is going to be in younger and closer to the time it was written than anything, any copy of anything in the classical world. I'm only going to show you the stuff, all the stuff that's closer to the time frame and better. Everything I'm going to show you from here on out. So you can see here you've got a fragment. Now that 114 is the earliest copy. That's probably not right. That's really conservative. I'm stretching it a lot to get the later date. But really the evidence is it's probably, this fragment's probably from 70, maybe as late as 90 AD of the book of John. So, and then you've got whole books, complete books, not just pieces and fragments. You've got whole books of it within 100 years after they were written. You've got most of the New Testament all together within 150 years, and you've got a whole bound books, incredible, within 225 years. Now, again, this is half the time from anything else. You walk over to the classics department, half the time. It's earlier, it's better. So here's the Codex Sinaiticus. It's one of the full, complete copies, a whole text from 325 AD. So it's maybe 250 years after the books were written. And you can see it's in pretty good shape. It's amazing because this is almost 1,700 years old. That, by the way, is in the British Museum. I've seen it. I've been in London. You can go to the British Museum. They got it under glass. You can go and you can actually see that. This one is in the Vatican. I haven't been to the Vatican, haven't been to Rome. But look at it's outstandingly preserved. And this is from about 325, 350. It's the complete New Testament, and it's most of the Old Testament. Here's the John Rylands papyrus. John Rylands was a wealthy guy in England. He's got a library. There's a library there, the John Rylands Library in England, and he's got a lot of early documents. But this is one of the pieces of the book of John. This is probably really dated by about 70 to 90 AD. This fragment of the book of John, it's both sides. You turn it over, it's also got writing on the other side. But this fragment of the book of John was probably from a copy of the book of John that was in circulation when John was still alive. And so J.A.T. Robinson, he's a liberal guy. He believed God was the ground of all being and had some strange ideas and beliefs. He didn't really believe the New Testament. But he went back. Most people in the 1800s and early 1900s, they study in colleges and they learn that the New Testament, it's not really historically reliable. It's interesting. And he was one of these. But he started investigating and he was convinced there's really no reason to believe any of that. And he looked at the information and he decided everything really was written in the first century, and they're all dated earlier, including that John Rylands papyrus of the book of John. Here's some more information. We don't have to go through it all, but here you go. Here's a John Rylands papyrus. There's 104 leaves, different leaves, manuscripts, scraps from the book of John. And that's probably, again, I put really, really conservative dates for all of them, 100 to 150, but probably many of them are actually more like 70 AD. So within Christ dying, you've got copies of documents that are really within the lifespan of when he died. And within 5 years of his death, there's a creed that's quoted in 1 Corinthians 15 that most scholars believe was orally transmitted within 3 to 5 years of Jesus' death. So that all these stories are made up later, that he rose from the dead, that he claimed he was God, you can't possibly really be intellectually honest and hold that, because even this early creed within a couple of years of his death was reciting those things. Here's some other things. You don't necessarily need this. In Egyptian, by 200 AD, they're copied into Egyptian, and you have translations in Egyptian. You have the Latin Vulgate, other things. So, external, the third test, the external evidence. There is no external textual evidence for any other document in the classical world. That third test, classics department say, do you have any evidence that Thucydides wrote that outside of Thucydides? They'll say, no, but we don't really care because we really think he wrote it. I mean, there's no reason to doubt it. Now, you go over and look at the New Testament, There's lots of external evidence I'm going to show you in the next slide. But also, all the early church fathers who wrote and quoted Scripture, they quoted the Bible, they quoted this text, that text. Somebody really did a lot of work. Some scholar did a ton of work and looked through all kinds of documents. He collated all the different verses, and he found out that if you didn't even have the New Testament, you could recreate the entire New Testament, all 27 books, except for 11 verses, just from the quotations of early church fathers from the first number of centuries. So, whoops. Okay, here's some more external evidence. You don't need to go through all of this in detail, but there, Jesus dies 33 AD. You've got Clement of Rome. He's a disciple of the apostles. He quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, 1 Corinthians, Titus, Hebrews, 2 Peter in 95 AD. So this guy's already quoting these books. Could they have been written later than 95 AD and him be quoting it? No. 170 to 110 AD, you've got Ignatius. He's quoting from all these different books. You've got Polycarp of Smyrna. He is an actual direct disciple of John. So he knew John. He hung out with John. He was discipled by John directly. He knew him well, was a good friend of his. And he says that Mark and Luke and Matthew and John wrote their books. All were either disciples, as John was, Matthew was, or in the case of Luke, was a close associate of disciples and accompanied Paul on his missionary journeys. So he confirms externally that these people wrote the books. So if you're saying they were made up later, other people added to them, did this, there's no evidence for that. All the evidence, even externally, supports the authorship. And remember, again, this kind of stuff does not exist for anything else in the ancient historical world. This is like golden stuff. Historians are like, wow, this is fantastic. I'd love to have that for Thucydides, but they don't. Here's, let's see. Anyway, you can see Irenaeus says that Clement heard and saw the apostles personally. This is Clement down here again, 95 AD. And he knew them. So sometimes people will quote something in a book that's disappeared from history, no longer around, it's been destroyed, it's deteriorated, but they're quoting from it so we know it existed, and that's what I'm talking about. They contain eyewitness testimony. The writers categorically state the nature of what they're writing. So they're saying these are historical accounts. These are eyewitness testimony. So for example, in 2 Peter it says, "For we did not follow cleverly devised stories or myths, but when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses to his majesty." So there's a bunch of other texts. I'll just read from Luke. I don't need to go into all of them because I don't have enough time really to do what I need to do tonight, but I'll just read from Luke. Luke says, "Many have undertaken to draw up," this is Luke 1:1, "many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." So he's starting in his book. So why would some scholars say, Luke's he's not accurate, he's not a historian? He's saying, I carefully investigated this, and we were eyewitnesses. So who knows better, Luke, who lived in the first century, or the Harvard professor in 1997? I kind of go with Luke. Will Durant, who's not a believer, not a Christian, but he says, he's looking at what the documents say, and he says, despite they got prejudice, they got theological preconceptions, these evangelists, but they record many incidents that mere inventors, people invented all these things, wouldn't have concealed. The completion of the apostles, they compete for the highest place. Am I going to be the top dog in the kingdom? Their flight after Jesus' arrest, they're cowards, they're wimps, They're not going to report that if they're making a story up. They're going to make themselves look good. Peter's denial of Christ, they're not going to say that because they're supposed to be heroes. The failure of Christ to work miracles in Galilee, how could this awesome leader, Jesus, he couldn't do something? He couldn't do miracles in Galilee? Why would they report that? The references of some authors to his possible insanity, his early uncertainty as to his mission, his confessions of ignorance as to the future, there's some things he didn't know. Who's going to concoct that and put it in account of, their hero and their leader and their God? His moments of bitterness, his despairing on the cross. No reading of these scenes can doubt the reality of the figure behind him. So this is even Will Durant. So here we're going to just briefly, I'm going to go through this quickly because this is a little bit technical stuff, but the science of textual criticism compares all known manuscripts to trace variations to discover the original form. So this is how they kind of sort through all these manuscripts that I've told you about to kind of see, is this one a later error? What's the earliest? What really did the original say? So the more manuscripts you have, more data you have, the more you can, well, this one's a little later and this one's probably the most accurate. The better you can, the more reliably you can know what the original says. So if you have only 8 copies of Thucydides, you don't have a very good database. If you got 25,000, you got a good database. You can really get a very good idea of what the original said, and you can be pretty highly probably certain. Not going to be 100% absolute. Remember, faith is the thing that jumps the gap, but you're going to be very highly certain. This guy, Dr. Bart Ehrman, chair of Religious Studies Department at University of North Carolina, said, there are more mistakes in the copies than there are words in the original text of the New Testament. So this is supposed to mean we can't rely on it. Now, anytime you go to a religious studies department, you got to have your I probably shouldn't say it in public, but your specific kind of detector on, to detect when, warning, illogical statement coming, because they're in the realm of religion. They can pretty much say anything. It's not really, you can't test it and stuff. But you go over to the classics department, you got the real story. So he says this, but really, it's not a logical thing to say because you can find a lot of errors because you got 25,000 documents. If you have a T that's not crossed, it's an error. And so and mistakes can be identified, you can identify them. This is a science of textual criticism. You got 25,000 copies, you can identify, look, this one in 400 AD, a copy in this area of the world over in Egypt, was copied and people copied from that. And we can see this is a mistake here, or this is an added thing here. So you got a lot of data, you can tell what happened. So it's not really a problem. And also once you got a variant, like somebody didn't cross a T, everybody that copies from that one doesn't cross the T. So if you have 1,000 documents, then you're going to say, oh, look, 1,000 mistakes, wow, And so he's adding up every single mistake in 25,000 copies like it's a big deal. It isn't. So these are the really significant examples. And this is the comma Johanneum in the King James Version, 1 John 5:7-8. I'm just giving an example of textual variants. For there are 3 that bear record. The oldest records just say, Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these 3 agree as one. But later versions looks like somebody added Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. In heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these 3 are one. And there are 3 that bear witness on earth. It added that blue portion. But does it say something really different? Does it change the text, change the theology? Does it change the doctrine, change any historical information? It doesn't. And another significant example in the Lord's Prayer, you all know the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven. Well, most of the early manuscripts in Matthew 6:9-13, they don't have the ending, for thine is the kingdom and power and the glory forever. They don't have that part in there. It just ends with, and forgive us our sins as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. And then it says, amen. It doesn't have this for thine is the kingdom part. Now, does that really change the prayer that much? Not really. And just because it's in later text, somebody might have put it in later text because that's what the tradition was. Maybe Jesus had a little bit longer prayer than's actually recorded. We don't know. But it's not a significant thing. The other thing is the woman caught in adultery. Everybody likes that story, the woman caught in adultery, and they asked Jesus, should we kill her or let her go? The law says this. And they were trying to trap him, and Jesus says, he writes in the sand, and then he says, okay, let the one who is without sin throw the first stone. And they start dropping their stones, and they walk away, right? And he says, neither I forgive you. Well, that whole story is not really in the earliest texts. It's not in the earliest manuscripts. So should it be in there or not? I don't know, but it probably is something that Jesus actually did, and it fits his nature, his teaching, his ministry, and it probably came from word of mouth. So just because it's a textual variant doesn't mean it's wrong. But these are the most significant differences among the text. So nothing affects doctrine or any significant historical data, and we can be fairly certain we know what the original manuscripts said. Obviously, if you've got people copying 25,000 times different documents, you're going to have some things here and there. But you know what the original document said. So if you doubt the historical accuracy of the Bible and you're intellectually consistent, as the dean of the law school I went to said, you'd have to throw out all your knowledge of the classical world. You can throw out the Bible. You can say it's not accurate. You can say, I don't want to pay attention to it. But if you're going to be consistent, you got to throw out all your knowledge of the ancient world. Egypt, forget it. Rome, forget it. Greece, forget it. So this is Sir Frederick Kennan. This is not like an evangelical Christian. This is not a guy that's, at, I don't know, Bible college in South Carolina or something. This is the principal librarian of the British Museum, which he oversaw the largest collection of historical manuscripts in the world, which is in the British Museum, probably the largest collection. And he said, in no other case is the interval of time between the composition of the book and the date of the earliest extant manuscripts so short as that in the New Testament. The books of the New Testament were written in the latter part of the first century. William F. Albright, known as pretty much the father of biblical archaeology and the biblical archaeology movement. This is kind of maybe the original Indiana Jones guy, right? So he says, in my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and the 80s of the first century, probably sometime between 50 and 75. So this is what the data causes these people to conclude this. They're not just experts like ask a scientist, These guys, that's what they spend their living doing, and they looked at all the evidence and they say, well, this is what the evidence shows. If you want to, you can look at the evidence yourself, but these guys have looked at it, and this is what they found. The interval then between the data and the original composition, this is F.F. Bruce, Greek scholar, and I think he was at either Oxford or Cambridge, but he's very widely respected, and he says, the interval between the data of the original composition and the earliest existing evidence has become so small, in fact, it's negligible, and the last foundation for any doubt that the Scripture has come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. Now, if you were in the 1700s, you wouldn't have as much data. 1800s, more data, more documents discovered. When he wrote, it really can be established. Sir William Ramsay is a famous archaeologist. He actually, in the 1800s, going to school, late 1800s, we think that a lot of skepticism and doubt is modern day, but in the 1800s, they would teach people that these documents they're not really that accurate, they're kind of interesting, but they're not really reliable. And that was what he was trained as. But he got a job going to Asia Minor, pretty much most of Turkey, and it was under British rule at the time, and he was interested in this. He was a brilliant guy, a really good investigator. He would investigate archaeological digs. Whenever they were building a house, and they found something, he'd be called in to that area of the country and he'd go look at it. And he'd discover, there's a stone that's got an inscription on it. So he did all this investigation for years, and he changed his mind. He said, wow, actually, Luke is a fabulous historian. And so painstaking and detailed archaeological and geographical investigations, he determined that Luke's history is unsurpassed in its trustworthiness. Now, if you read this, there's a little technical stuff in it, but it's kind of interesting. He'll talk about little details that scholars would question. Oh, Luke is talking about the Laodiceans, and really it was a Roman province, and it's Cappadocia. So it's all right, but he's not really historically accurate. Ramsey's digging around, and he finds a house being built, and they run into this this stone, and they dig it up, and they see the inscription, and he finds dig after dig, and he finds that actually the people living there, they called themselves Laodiceans. So it's actually the professors at Oxford that were wrong. Luke was right. And only somebody who had an intimate knowledge of the community and the people would actually know those kind of things. So he'd go through example after example after example. In his book, you can read it. But it supports the New Testament and as him as a first-rate historian. So what do the documents say? We've established their eyewitness testimony. They're reliable. So what do these people say in them? Jesus claims to be God. Remember, that's our number 2 or number 3 hypothesis. He who has seen me has seen the Father, he says in John 14:9. In John 8:57 to 59, the Pharisees are saying, you're not even 50 years old, and you said you've seen Abraham? Because he just told them he has seen Abraham. And he tells them, I tell you the truth. Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. Now, to somebody who's, in the 20th century, maybe a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon or something, they would argue with, well, he didn't really claim he was God. He's kind of saying he's the Son of God. But you have to consider the context. Jesus is a Jew. He went through Bar Mitzvah. He studied the Torah. He's immersed in that culture. God is one. Lord our God is one. That's the main thing, in the book of Exodus. And he is identifying, when he says, I am, that's the Greek words ego eimi. That's the same word that the Jews translated into Greek in the Old Testament hundreds of years before Christ as God using from the burning bush to Moses. Who do I say sent you? Who am I going to tell them sent me? And God says to him, tell them I am. And that word, Yahweh, actually the Jews consider it so sacred and holy that they wouldn't even put the vowels in there, only the consonants. So Jesus knew what he was saying, and his audience knew what he was saying. That's why, at this point, they picked up stones to stone him, because they knew he was claiming to be God. Mark 14:61 to 64, he's been on trial. Good Friday's coming up, middle of the night. They get Jesus in Gethsemane. They whisk him off to a kangaroo court in the middle of the night, in the early morning, and the religious leaders are asking him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus says, whoops, there he is again. He doesn't seem to be able to stop. He says, I am, said Jesus. The same words, telling them clearly, he's saying, I am that God who appeared to Moses. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, if you're like, again, if you're a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon or, I don't know. He says he's the Son of Man. He's really a man. He's the Son of Man. But to a Jew, they knew. This is a reference to the book of Daniel. This is one of the most lofty references to the God of the universe who's going to come and judge the whole world. He's coming on the clouds of heaven, and you better hide if you don't know him, because he's going to judge you. He's going to judge the whole world. Nobody can judge you. No man gets to judge another man, but God is the judge, and that's what the reference is to Daniel. So that's why the high priest tore his clothes, which was like, oh my goodness, and why do we need any more witnesses? He asked. You've heard the blasphemy. What's he talking about? He's saying a mere man is clearly claiming to be God Almighty. Jesus didn't deny it. He clearly did say this. So that's why they killed him. Jesus demonstrates this by his actions. So he's claiming to be God. Now he demonstrates it by his actions. He does all these miracles in public. As you see, even external biblical sources claim he did some miraculous things. He was well known. They were well known what he did. He even had to withdraw from the cities because he was going to be mobbed, to avoid being mobbed as a result, because people wanted to get healed by him. They knew, wow, there's something going on here. And he knows the hearts and minds. Even the disciples record, we were thinking this, and he knows it, and he talks to us. And the Pharisees are thinking this, and he knew what they were saying, and he says this to them. Now, this is going to be important later, because even in the records and what they're saying, they're talking about people who are hostile to Jesus, who want to keep this thing under wraps, want to stop it in its tracks. And the eyewitnesses are talking about what happened between Jesus and them. Do you think they would have said, no, it didn't happen. That wasn't what we were thinking. He didn't say that. Do you think they would have said something about it? And the final thing is the resurrection, which is what we're going to go into. This is really the demonstration. So in John 2:18, Jews demanded a sign. What miraculous sign can you do to prove that you have this authority? Jesus answered them. He says, destroy this temple. I'll take it up in 3 days. They're thinking he's talking about the temple. But the temple he spoke of was his body after he's raised from the dead. His disciples recalled what he said. He was talking about his body. Destroy this temple. I'll raise it up in 3 days, my body. So he predicts he's going to rise. He says, Matthew 16:21, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. So they're recording that he's predicting and saying this is what he's going to do. There's a whole bunch of other verses I'm not going to go into. But he did say to these eyewitnesses that he was going to die and rise from the dead to prove who he was. Jesus was dead on Good Friday. So the soldiers came as he's hanging on the cross. Any of you see the Passion of the Christ? The soldiers come, therefore, this is after he is hanging on the cross, he's dead. They break the legs of the first man who had been crucified with him, and then those of the other. Then they come to Jesus, and guess what they do? They did not break his legs. Why didn't they break his legs? What's that?
Old Testament prophecy.
Old Testament. He was already dead. He was already dead. And why would they break the legs of the other guys?
Because of the Sabbath, they were rushed for time.
Rushed for time? So, but why would they break the legs?
To speed up their death.
That's right, because he was not dead. See, in a crucifixion, and you're going to see this in the next slide, I'll show you, the death is really by suffocation. So you're hanging there. You got your feet nailed and your hands nailed, and you're hanging there. And it's the reverse of when we breathe, we take a breath in. You know, we use our intercostal muscles to take a breath in, and then relax, and the breath comes out. It's passive exhaling, it's active inhaling. When you're hanging there, it's the reverse. You got to use muscles that you don't usually use to try and exhale. It's hard to exhale. Inhaling is the passive thing. And in order to breathe, you really have to usually push up to get that breath, to release that breath. And it'd be incredibly painful because your legs would be nailed to the cross. It'd just be incredibly painful to take every breath that you'd have to move to take the breath. And that's where, by the way, we have the word painful, and then we have excruciatingly painful, like the most pain you could get. It really comes from the word ex, which is out, Greek word for out, and crucia, which is the cross, out of the cross. It was the most painful means of execution devised. This was a horrible thing. And yet, so Jesus, the other ones, the soldiers must have had to have noticed that they still were alive, they were still breathing. So they break their legs, so they can't push up anymore, and they suffocate and they die quickly. Jesus, they noticed, he was dead, so they didn't bother to break his legs, which, by the way, fulfills an Old Testament prophecy. And I'm going to tell you, by the way, next time, May 1st, we're going to do another one of these, and I'm going to talk about where these documents come from, who wrote them, and I'm also going to talk about prophecy, the prophecies that really were fulfilled. Were they fulfilled? Were they not fulfilled? I'll talk about the details of that. But this is one of them. So, sorry. And Then the soldier, instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. I'm going to talk about that later. That's also an indication of death. We have a PA, physician's assistant, in here, and if you have water and blood coming out of your side from a spear pierced in, he's pierced the pericardial sac and the heart, and blood and water separated, is the guy knew what he was doing. He was an executioner. That's what he did for a living. He knew Jesus is dead. That also fulfilled a prophecy, by the way. And the man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. So this is John saying, I'm giving testimony. I was there. I was looking at it. John was there, by the way, at the cross. This is from the Journal of the American Medical Association, March 21st, 1986. And what happened, the journal reviewed what would happen when Christ was crucified. And they went through the flogging, bone and metal balls. They would lash the person. The Jews had a law you couldn't lash them more than 40. You couldn't lash them 40 times, because if you did too many, you would take too much blood. The person might be at risk of dying, and it was just way too cruel. So they could only lash them 39 times. And if you read in the book of Acts, you see Paul is lashed 39 times in different occasions. He's scourged. Jesus was scourged. But this would have been a scourging, massive loss of blood. He would have been really weakened, close to the point of even dying. And then the sword piercing his side, the soldier knew what he was doing. This was his profession. So he put that spear exactly right in the right rib. He knew he was going right into the heart. He knew where the heart was. That's his job. He's a fighter. He's a soldier. He knows how to kill. And he puts a spear right into the heart, and blood and water come out. So this is in the Journal of the American Medical Association, just talking about this, and then talking about the crucifixion, what I said about breathing and what happens, how you suffocate. So the Journal of the American Medical Association certainly is convinced. This is the premier journal of medicine in the United States, and they are completely convinced that he was dead. In 1968, we found in a suburb of Jerusalem, archaeologists found the bone pierced with a nail of a crucified young man. Just an example. The second fact is he's observed alive. So later, Joseph took the body, wrapped it in clean linen, laid it in a tomb. Next day, the Pharisees went to Pilate. They say, remember, while he was alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I'll rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure on the third day. Otherwise, the disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people he's risen from the dead. This deception will be worse than the first. So they wanted to make sure nothing happened. So Pilate said, take a guard, go make the tomb secure, as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting a guard. This is a Roman guard. This is the kind of a guard that would be trained. It's like our Navy SEALs. They would be specially highly elite trained force that would be able to defend something like a 20 square foot area from an invading army. These are not the little guys in miniskirts, that you see in the cartoons, So these guys are serious business, and this ragtag bunch of disciples who are despondent and depressed, hiding out in the upper room, they're going to come tangle with these, elite fighting Roman force in front of the tomb. By the way, these Roman soldiers also, if they failed at their post, if they fell asleep at the job or something, they got executed. So they had a high motivation to guard that tomb, make sure nothing happened. And the seal on the tomb, that's like saying the Roman Empire says, you break this seal, you're done, you're dead. We got our FBI or CIA, or we got everything coming after you. So that would have been a further discouragement for anybody messing with that tomb. But when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices. They were going to try and anoint Jesus. They said, who's going to roll the stone away so we can do this to the body? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. Frank Morrison, who did that investigation I showed earlier, he calculated the size of the stone according to Greek and what tombs were like. And the Greek word says it was rolled away up an incline. The stone would have had to be about 2 to 2.5 tons. Not anybody's going to just roll away that stone. That's a serious business. Take a lot of people to really roll away the stone. But it was rolled away. Why was it rolled away? It wasn't rolled away so Jesus could get out. It was rolled away so people could see that he was gone. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. They weren't expecting him to be there, obviously. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and feet. It's I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones, as you see I have." So this is one resurrection appearance. Alive at point B. Touch him, see. Luke 24:40-42. When he said this, he showed them his hands and feet, and while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, this is another appearance, he asked them, "Do you have anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish. Apparently they liked fish then, and they were broiling some fish. They had some, and he took it and ate in their presence. This is very significant because dead people usually don't eat broiled fish. And by the way, neither do ghosts. The dean of the law school I went to has 11 earned degrees. One area that he really studied and he liked a lot was the supernatural and the occult. And he studied all these stories from around the world. And he said, there's no stories anywhere of ghosts eating things or eating fish. He postulated it probably because they don't have stomachs. But observed resurrection. Later, Jesus himself appeared again to his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, which is the same as the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. Simon, Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Cana, Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and 2 other disciples were together. Now, does this sound like a story? Or does this sound like, somebody reporting, this, and that guy was here from this area? This is historical stuff they're talking about. And 2 other disciples, Simon Peter told them, "I'm going fishing." That's what he knew how to do. His leader was dead. He's going to go back fishing. They said, "We'll go with you." Sounds like a good idea. Actually, fishing is kind of fun. It's probably a good idea. If I was depressed, maybe, it's a good idea. So they set out in a boat, but throughout the night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples didn't realize it was Jesus. Apparently, they didn't expect to see him. Maybe he was further away, or maybe he was kind of veiling his presence, but they didn't recognize him. Early in the morning, they didn't realize it was Jesus. That's a repeat. So John 21:12, Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." They knew it was the Lord. Then they knew it was the Lord. And it was the 3rd time he appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead, when they had finished eating, and it goes on. So there again, he's eating fish. Dead people don't do that. Ghosts don't do that. John 21:22, Peter turned around and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following him. I'm just showing that John is recording an eyewitness account of what happened. He's recording, he's saying, I'm the one who was there. I'm watching this happen. Acts 1:3. After his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to him over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. Acts 26:26. And King Agrippa. Now, he's before King Agrippa. He's in chains. Paul's in chains. He's before the King Agrippa, who has the power to condemn him and take his life. Now, if you're in chains, if you're trying to convince somebody, do you appeal to, you already know about this. If they don't know about it, he says, "The king knows about these things. I speak boldly, for I am sure these events are familiar to the king, for they were not done in a corner." So he's talking about Jesus' death and his resurrection. And he says, you can check it out. I know you know about it because you can check it out and you already know about it. You don't do that unless it's true. 1 Corinthians 15:3-6. This is talking about what happened. 3rd day he rose. And then the 12th, after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom were still living. So when Paul wrote that, there's most of these 500. It's not just the disciples, it's lots of people over a 40-day period. So you've got, now this is important. I talked about this earlier. You don't just have eyewitness testimony. You've got to check on it. In a courtroom, what you've got is you've got put somebody on the stand, and then you get the opposing lawyer to cross-examine them. You see Perry Mason or any of those legal programs. They're like, okay, now, asking them some really tough questions, try to trip them up. And cross-examination is a good check on false testimony. Well, in the case of these eyewitnesses, you have something unusual in any historical sense, or certainly in the classical world. You have these people going out and telling what happened to an audience that's hostile. They're going to the temple. They're going to the religious leaders. They're going to the synagogues, right in downtown Jerusalem. These are the people who were there, who saw Jesus hanging on the cross, who could go and check out the tomb, 15-minute walk from downtown Jerusalem. These are people who had the means. They could have talked about it. They could have refuted it, because they were the people who were at the events. They knew if they were saying Jesus read the Pharisees' mind and he was saying this and Jesus said that to him, if that didn't happen, they would have blown the whistle. And they had the motive, because they didn't want this thing. They wanted to kill this thing. They wanted to stop. So they had the motive, and they had the opportunity, because it was happening right in front of them that they were proclaiming this message. So that's powerful. They certainly would have if they could have. But the Jews and the Romans, those are the two parties that wanted to stop this thing in the tracks and could have done it if they had the facts to do that. Now, there's no evidence, there's no writing, there's nothing that shows that anybody was able to refute it or wrote anything to refute it. That's pretty powerful. So you've got all this evidence, 27 books, 27 writing. You've got external evidence. You've got the eyewitness testimonies. You've got all these people actually are willing to give up everything to say this. And you've got, on the other side, crickets. It's pretty powerful stuff. So now, if you're telling truthful testimony, here's what you have to do. It's not too hard if you're telling the truth in a court. You have the event. You recollect what the facts are. You select what you're going to communicate, and then you choose the words and you tell what happened. Now, if you're lying, it's a lot more difficult to get away with it. What happens is you have an event, you have a recollection of the event, so you remember actually what did happen, but you choose a self-serving distortion, to present. You know what happened, and you're presenting something different than what happened, but you have to compare it with the person you're talking to, what they know, because if they already know something and you're trying to make up a story and they already know part of it's false, then you got to kind of know what they're saying. Keep that in your mind. And then you have to compare it with other witnesses that might have testified before you, so you can't contradict them. Your story has to fit what they say. And then you've got to check for obvious discrepancies that somebody can check. They can check common knowledge that oh, that fact's wrong, and okay, and discredit you. So you got to check with that. You can't put that in the story. And then you have to estimate if you're going to be discovered and how you're going to get away with, so you only say enough so that you might not get discovered. And then you got to decide after you tell a story and they ask you more questions whether you're going to revise or stick with the same story. And then you got to select what you're going to communicate, and then you have to use symbols, and then you have to choose the words. So there's a lot going on there, right? Kind of hard to do. And that's why under cross-examination it's pretty powerful. Trip them up. You see the kind of trials that have the I forget what the lady's name was who they convicted of killing her boyfriend and stuff. But her story was one thing, and it sounded, but then it changed, and then she said, and it's very, very hard to maintain a lie if you're really being interviewed by people who are trying to discover you. It's very unlikely that they would have been able to do this. Now, I'll talk a little bit about, what about the different accounts, eyewitness accounts? You got one account that says there was one angel at the tomb. There's another account that says there were two angels. Oh, it's a contradiction. Well, is it a contradiction? why is it not a contradiction? You're right, it's not a contradiction, but why? Because if there were two angels, was there one? There's at least one. So, he sees one and somebody else thought, well, there were two. What would be a contradiction would be there was one and only one angel. And then the other witness says there were two angels. Now that's a contradiction because he's saying there's only one angel. There's not two. And the other one says there's two at the same place and the same time. That would be a contradiction. But the other's not a contradiction. It's just different accounts, different perspectives by different witnesses. Somebody sees an accident, they see one thing, they report some things, they don't report everything the other eyewitness says, then that's fine because the other eyewitness is looking at it from a different perspective. If it's not an actual logical contradiction. I talked to when I learned about the facts and stuff, then I went back for the summer vacation. I was a junior in college, and my dad wanted me to interview my pastor of my church because I was like, how come he never told me any of this stuff? I suspected he really didn't believe the documents were reliable anyway, even though he was a reverend in the Episcopal Church. So I sat down and I asked him, and he said, oh yeah, it's accurate and in truth and practice, it's reliable in that. And I said, but do you think it's reliable historically, scientifically? And he said, no, it's not meant to be that. I said, like, what do you mean? What errors do you think, for example? He said, well, when he fed 5,000, they didn't have calculators back then. 5,000, 4,000, 3,000. You don't have to really rely on that. It's not really meant to be that. And apparently I've been reading the Bible more than he had, because I already knew that, hey, Matthew says he feeds 5,000 in Matthew 14, and in Matthew 15 he feeds 4,000. Do you think he could have fed more than one crowd? Maybe a different number of people? So they're too quick to jump on the errors or contradictions when it's not really a contradiction. So identical counts, actually, if you didn't have different accounts, one angel, two angel, in legal testimony, you would suspect collusion because they lined up and they got their accounts and this is a story. Yep, here's the story. Make sure you match the story. Say, you see the politicians, they all got the talking points. They're all like the same points, right? It's the same thing. Well, they kind of collusion. This is the story. We got the story. Come on, just say the story. Don't go beyond the story. But if you got to start getting them off script, then you get the real story, But in the case of the New Testament documents, the fact that they don't match identical is actually evidence that they are separate eyewitness accounts, and supports the more accuracy because they're not colluding. So here's the possibilities. The eyewitnesses lied. They stole the body. Now, how? In a court of law, we're trying to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. Not any possibility in the universe, but beyond a reasonable doubt, a reasonable person. Because otherwise you never make any decision ever in life. But high probability, reasonable doubt. Is it reasonable that the eyewitnesses lied? That they stole the body? We already talked about the Roman guards, and they have to fight off the Roman guards. They have to risk the Roman Empire after them. They would have to roll the 2.5-ton stone out of the way. They would have to steal the body. Then they would have to go out and they would have to proclaim that Jesus rose from the dead. They'd have to be lying about that because they were the ones that stole the body. They're the ones that know. They'd be lying because they knew. And then they'd have to lose everything, lose all their property, lose their friends. They'd have to be hunted down and persecuted. And 11 out of 12 of them die martyrs' deaths. Why would they do that? They would do that for something that they made up and they knew it was false because they're the ones that made it up and stole the body? Does that make any sense? Is that reasonable? I mean, if you believe that, then, you have no problem with the resurrection. And some people say, well, it's a psychological miracle. It's never happened in history, but maybe they did it. Well, if you had some evidence for that, maybe you could make a case. If you had the hostile eyewitnesses saying, no, the body's still, I saw them steal the body, or, some other thing to indicate that, maybe you could say something. There's one miracle that happened psychologically. It's never happened in the history of the world, that people died for something that they knew was false. But, I guess it could happen. But there's no evidence for that, see? So there's not only no evidence for that, but it doesn't make any sense. Other possibility is They believe, but they're hallucinating. They were deluded. Well, I guess you'd have all 12 of them hallucinating, and they weren't really willing to because they were slow to believe it. 7 days later, Thomas is saying, wait. I don't know. I'm not going to believe it unless I feel it. So I guess they were visually hallucinating, and they were auditorially hallucinating, and they were also tactily hallucinating, and they were eating fish, so so all the senses. That's not very reasonable. People hallucinate; they usually will hear something. I'm a psychologist. Sometimes they'll see something. Tactile things are a little more rare, but you got everything going on together, and you've got all these people doing this at the same time. They must have been smoking some really weird mushrooms. And it's not likely they're kind of down-to-earth people. And then you got 500 at once hallucinating the exact same thing. Not very likely. And they had every opportunity, by the way, to check it out again and again and again over 40 days. Here he is there, here he is there. They have every opportunity to check it out, bring it to somebody else, they check it out. It just isn't, it's not something that happens. So they were mistaken. Maybe they saw a ghost. Well, we already saw ghosts don't eat fish. It doesn't behave like a ghost, they thought. Maybe it would be, but they tested the hypothesis. Absolutely, the evidence is against that. It's an imposter. I like this one. An imposter fooled them. Somehow, they're with him 3 days, 24/7, or 3 years, 24/7. They know the guy, and like somebody else is going to, appear to them and convince them that he's the same guy. And by the way, he's going to put holes in his arms and his feet somehow, and that's really not very likely. If anybody knows him, they're going to know him. Maybe if you just saw somebody once and then an imposter, or if you thought, oh, maybe that's President Obama, but you never met him, maybe. But not somebody you spent 3 years with day in, day out, 24/7. And not all of them? So that's not really likely. The swoon theory, I already talked about that one. Maybe he didn't really die. I like that one. Some professors at Harvard say, kind of promoted that. He didn't really die. This is a Roman crucifixion team. This is what they did for a living. Plus, you'd have to say deny the evidence of the blood and water coming out, the spear, deny the evidence of they didn't broke his legs, deny the evidence of, the guys, I guess the guys that were burying him, they didn't know recognize he was dead. I guess the Roman soldiers there, they didn't know he was dead. They rolled a stone against the door. What happened? He, somehow in the tomb, he resuscitated the cool air or something, and he jumped up, ripped out the clothes, hobbled over to the door, rolled a 2.5-ton stone out of the way, and he would have been in a weakened state, and lashing and crucifying. He appears to his disciples as the Lord of glory. He would have been kind of like a medical case, This doesn't make any sense whatsoever either. American Medical Society doesn't think so. The Journal of the American Medical Society didn't think so. So they went to the wrong tomb. They all went to the wrong tomb. It was Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. You think he'd know his tomb? He bought it, he carved it out. You think he's kind of going to know his tomb. So the women went to the wrong tomb. Then I guess the soldiers went to the wrong tomb because they went and told the Jewish religious leaders that the tomb was empty. They must have gone to the wrong tomb. Then the religious leaders probably checked it out. They went to the wrong tomb. Then the other disciples went to the wrong tomb. Everybody went to the wrong tomb. I don't think so. It's not reasonable doubt. And plus, if they went to the wrong tomb, then the people who knew the right tomb could have said, oh, guess what? Let's open the tomb, see, there's Jesus' body. They could have killed the whole thing right at the start. And they didn't do that. So the Romans crucified the wrong man. Really? It's hard to even address that one. It's so preposterous because he's with the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas indicates who he is. He says, I am. All the Romans take him. The disciples know who he is. They're afraid. Peter's there. John's there. The religious leaders knew him because he was public and they were, always interacting with him. They tried him. Pilate would have made the mistake and the wrong. Really, you can't. This is just not reasonable. they really did observe a resurrected Christ. That's really the reasonable, the proof leads to that reasonable conclusion. So this led Dr. Simon Greenleaf, he's professor at Harvard Law School, that actually he and one other guy put Harvard Law School on the map over 100 years ago. The other guy was a Supreme Court justice named Story, but he was an expert in evidence. There's a 2-volume work, a treatise on the law of evidence, and there's a second volume he wrote. But he was an expert on what constitutes good evidence in a courtroom and eyewitness testimony, and how do you evaluate it. So this was used by law schools for 100 years. There's still law schools, I've heard people, that go to law school that use the same text. They're that good. But he was not a believer. His class students challenged him and said, apply your techniques to the resurrection. And he said, all right. He did it, intending to prove it wrong. And he found out, wow, this is really good. This evidence is really good. And he went on to write a book called The Testimony of the Evangelists, the Gospels Examined by the Rules of Evidence. And it's a really short book. You can get it. It's not really a long book for those of you who don't read too much. I don't think it has pictures in it, though. But the evidence which we have of the great facts of the Bible history belongs to this class. That is, it's moral evidence sufficient to satisfy any rational mind by carrying it to the highest degree of moral certainty. If such evidence will justify the taking away of human life, because they had capital punishment over 100 years ago, more common, or taking away liberty, putting them in jail, in the one case, surely it ought to be deemed sufficient to determine our faith on the other. So he's saying you're going to use those same kind of techniques. It's good for this, good enough for this, it's got to be good enough for that. Here's Charles Colson. I'm going to end with this and we're going to ask questions. Sorry we started a little bit late, so we're going a little late. But Charles Colson was a former aide to President Richard Nixon. I don't know if any of you remember Watergate? So he's a brilliant guy, but the press called him an evil mastermind. He was a right-hand man, the hatchet man for Nixon. He would do anything to get him elected. One press guy, some people said he said it, but he didn't. Actually, one of the press persons said that he would run over his grandmother to get Nixon elected. But he was a ruthless guy. He was caught up in Watergate, and he ended up going to jail. He actually didn't do anything in Watergate, but he felt something was moving inside his heart, and he felt convicted. And he actually confessed to basically slandering one of the political opponents and leaking stuff out that wasn't true to get the guy, out of the race. And he got put in jail for that. Back then, you got put in jail for that. Today, you probably get elected. But anyway, so he died in 2012. Here's the New York Times. And here's what he says on Watergate. Before all the facts were known to the public, in March 1973, it was becoming clear to Nixon's closest aides that someone had tried to cover up the Watergate break-in. There were no more than a dozen of us. Could we maintain a cover-up to save the president? Consider that we were political zealots among the most powerful men in the world, had a great deal to lose, military officers at our beck and call, airplanes waiting to take us anywhere we wanted to go. With all that at stake, you'd expect us to be capable of maintaining a lie to protect the president. But we couldn't do it. We just lasted 3 weeks. So what I'm going to show you now is...
Hi, I'm Chuck Colson with this week's 2-Minute Warning. I hope you and your families and friends have a holy, blessed Easter. I will, because I'll be in prison, as I've done for the last 30 years. We celebrate because we as Christians know that our Lord is risen from the dead, and in his resurrection is our hope of everlasting life with God. Indeed, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, the historical fact of Christ's resurrection is the only basis of our hope. Without the resurrection, our faith is futile. This is why critics of Christianity often try to explain away the empty tomb. They claim that the disciples lied, that they stole Jesus' body themselves, conspired together to pretend he'd risen. The apostles then managed somehow to recruit more than 500 people to lie for them as well, to say they saw Jesus after he rose from the dead. How plausible is this theory? Well, to answer that question, fast forward nearly 2,000 years to an event I happen to know a lot about, Watergate. You see, before all the facts about Watergate were known to the public, in March of 1973, it was becoming clear to Nixon's closest aides that someone had tried to cover up the Watergate break-in. There were no more than a dozen of us. Could we maintain a cover-up to save the president? Consider this. We were political zealots. We enjoyed enormous political power and prestige. And with all that at stake, you'd expect us to be capable of maintaining a lie to protect the president? But we couldn't. The first to crack was John Dean. First he told the president everything, and then just 2 weeks later, he went to the prosecutors and offered to testify against the president. His reason, as he candidly admits in his memoirs, was to save his own skin. And after that, everyone started scrambling to protect himself. What we know today as the Great Watergate cover-up lasted less than 3 weeks. Some of the most powerful politicians in the world, and we couldn't keep alive for more than 3 weeks? Let's go back to the question of the historicity of Christ's resurrection. Can anyone really believe that for 50 years the Jesus' disciples were willing to be ostracized, beaten, persecuted, and all but one of them suffer a martyr's death without ever renouncing their conviction that they had seen Jesus bodily resurrected? Does anyone really think the disciples could have maintained a lie at that time, all that time, under that kind of pressure? No. Somebody would have cracked, just as we did so easily in Watergate. Someone would have acted as John Dean did and turned state's evidence. There would have been some kind of smoking gun, a deathbed confession. So why didn't they crack? Because they had come face to face with the living God, and they couldn't deny what they had seen. The fact is that people will give their lives for what they believe to be true, but they will never give their lives for what they know is a lie. The Watergate cover-up proves that 12 most powerful men in America couldn't keep a lie, and that 12 powerless men 2,000 years ago couldn't have been telling anything but the truth. And the inmates I speak to in prison get this. So have a blessed Easter, firm in your faith that the Lord is risen. He is risen indeed. I'm Chuck Colson. That's this week's 2-Minute Warning.
Okay, thank you. That's it. What we'll do is, is this all right? All right. My wife's giving me signals that it's not too good. So what we'll do now is we will ask, we're gonna stop. You can go, you can stay. If you have questions, pass them to the side and I'll take them up, or you can ask them personally and I'll answer them. But we are opening for questions. Yes.
So on one slide, when you talked about lying,
Yes.
you went through and you had the whole chart there, and then you talked about it later, but, and you said they had to lie and say, these are the facts we know, and our story's got to, like, mesh with that. But I think the biggest thing that you missed right there was the whole colluding. They had to then, okay, I got this lie, now you got to go make sure everybody else got the same exact lie, and make sure everybody's stories are straight, and I think that's where, I mean, it's hard enough to go through what your chart was, but it's hard enough to get everybody else to agree, because everybody goes, oh, I got a better lie. You know, I forgot the lie. What did you say? Oh, I said
Right,
this. You know,
right,
but that's
right.
missing from that.
That was just one person lying, not, 500, right? So it becomes even harder, yeah. Good point. Anybody got any other questions? On that point of colluding, yeah, they would have to maintain that over a long period of time too. It's just preposterous that would happen. And they have to check their stories and everything. Yeah, it makes it much more, it multiplies it exponentially. Yes?
Just to clarify, we talk about eyewitnesses, and I don't even know if this is right, but I heard that the most unreliable are eyewitnesses when it comes to seeing an event or something, because everybody's got their own opinion, and who do you believe, this one or that one? How do you answer that question if someone says, well, eyewitnesses are not really reliable?
Yes. Well, that's what you would have to say. The point is, people can err, and they can not really remember things. And usually what the demonstration of that, how the unreliability of eyewitnesses, there's a person named Elizabeth Loftus at George Washington University who has done most of the work on that. I've heard her at conferences, psychological conferences, talking about, what happens with eyewitness testimony. You can kind of plant ideas in people's heads, and that was the big thing with sort of planting ideas and suggesting that people have been molested when they hadn't and stuff, and what are therapists doing. They got to be very careful about that, especially for early events that are way in the past. So she demonstrated that if somebody who was a really trusted individual, like the person's mother, would say, look, we lost you in the mall when you were 3 or 4 years old, and we couldn't find you for hours, and and then have other people say it, the person really starts to, yeah, and then, yeah, I kind of remember that, when they didn't really, it never happened and they don't remember that. But that's very different. That's very different from somebody being in an event that they have an opportunity to check and double check, and they do it over time. And also, if an event's something that is kind of like, well, I don't know if I remember it, but I think, yeah, I remember this happening. It's different from something that is very, very salient. Like, if somebody's in a very dangerous situation or a traumatic situation, they'll remember specific details and all kinds of things. We know this in trauma work. Somebody will remember exactly different minute details of what happened with exquisite accuracy because their brain is on high function, high alert. So if you're at an elevated state, oh my goodness, we're scared. You're gonna, and things are, wow, this is incredible. These are not events like, oh, maybe I lost my, I lost my wallet. I think I did maybe 2 years ago I lost my wallet. That's not the kind of event we're talking about. And she's doing research with different kinds of events. And interestingly enough, Elizabeth Loftus, because of her research, somebody came to her actually, who was doing something as far as, and I think I'm not sure, but I think she might be Jewish, but they were doing a trial of somebody who was a Nazi, and they asked her to testify to show that, the eyewitness testimony, the people who were saying, yeah, that's the guy who was in the prison camp, he did this, to say, look, you can't trust eyewitness testimony, and to get, to damage the eyewitness testimony, and her to testify as an expert to say you can't trust eyewitness testimony, because that's what they were using to try the guy. She refused to do it. Why did you do that? Because she actually really does trust eyewitness testimony. It's just certain kinds of eyewitness testimony that are planted and not under really salient conditions where you can double check and check it out. See, and even what she's saying, interestingly enough, her research is based on observations. What is eyewitness testimony? It's just observations of people or remembering what they observed. So you ask her, well, how do you know that? Well, we did these testings and those testings. Well, what do you mean? You observed that? You're saying you remembered observing that? So you can't, you have to use it. So the fact that people can err doesn't mean they always err, right? And you have to look at the testimony to see what the circumstances are around it to see how powerful it is. But you can create false memories and stuff, but that's not the same thing as what we're talking about here. We're talking about very, very extreme circumstances where their senses are really pay attention, and it's not something that they want to believe, and they have every reason not to believe it. And they get to check it out, and they have weeks to do so, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. But good question, good question. By the way, I didn't talk a lot about it, but the empty tomb is a big piece of evidence too. Even if the disciples, you can't believe their stories, how do you explain the empty tomb? Because the Romans could have knew where the tomb was, and it was empty. The Jews knew the tomb was empty. They just didn't have an explanation for it. Somebody else? Yes.
Compare the books, certain books of the Bible to other literary works in terms of validity. How about other holy books, such as the Islamic Quran?
Mm-hmm.
Does that compare there at all?
Yeah, your question is, how do other books, holy books like the Quran, compare to the Bible as far as evidence and eyewitness testimony and the like?
Yeah.
Excellent question. You can ask a Muslim this. I go on the internet and I look and I see, what's their evidence? Why do they think Islam is correct? They will not give you. See, Muhammad didn't do any miracles. He did nothing to demonstrate, the validity of his message. The only thing they say is that Muhammad actually won a few battles that, with a less number of people, so God's blessing must be on him. But he didn't demonstrate it by any miracles. He certainly didn't rise from the dead. And he says that he was in a cave all by himself, and he had this revelation, some supernatural being speak to him. This is not something done in public. Other people basically have to trust him, what he says, and trust that it came from whatever source it came from. But there's no validation. There's no even attempt to validate it. The thing that the Muslims will say is the Quran is such an amazing book. It's so eloquent and well written. It just touches you. It's just amazing. And that's the evidence for it. Not anything factual. They don't even put it up on the realm of being able to be disproven or tested. It's the same way, by the way, with other religious works, the Bhagavad Gita. It's not even claiming. It's like that third category, nonsensical, it doesn't matter. We're not going to say it's, test it. Just see if you like it, try it. It's amazing. The Book of Mormon is another one, by the way, that the mistake that Joseph Smith made is that he put a lot of details in the Book of Mormon. He was I think he was taking it from the King James Version. He writes it kind of like King James Version. He put a lot of details about the early Americas and stuff. So he opened himself up to archaeological checking and investigation. And actually the Book of Mormon has been, there's nothing archaeologically that supports it. So all the other religions, they don't really put themselves up for any falsifiability. Does that answer your question? Yes?
Being a psychologist, how do you explain that people believe in things that are so illogical?
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that?
Yeah, well, it's not just having to do with religion.
No.
It's a lot of things people believe psychologically that are illogical, yeah. So there's a whole emotional factor, and there's a lot of reasons we want to believe things and wish fulfillment, and we have our pride, and there's a lot of reasons, psychological reasons. But the psychological reasons have to be explaining why somebody believes something that's wrong has to come after demonstrating that what they believe is wrong. You can't explain, well, you believe in the resurrection because it makes you feel good until you demonstrated that there was no resurrection, and the reason you're believing in it is just because it makes you feel good, see? So the psychological reasons are secondary. But people believe all sorts of things for all sorts of, reasons, and they kind of hold on to them for various kinds of reasons, and everybody's in...
Evolution, if you compare evolution and creation, I mean, the scientific facts of creation, based on what the scientific community feels today as far as evolution and, intelligent design and all that. The person that believes in evolution, I never could understand it because they just say, well, that's just the way it is. But you can give them fact after fact after fact.
Yeah, and there's personal reasons. But see, the disciples, they did not believe, and they were slow to believe. And they were with Jesus for 3 years, and they didn't believe. They wanted a Messiah to wipe out the Romans and free Israel and make them a nation again, not under occupation. They didn't do that. So changing their mind required really solid evidence. And sometimes people they need a lot of evidence. But there's also a psychological thing going on. That's a whole other story. Did somebody else have a question here? Somebody? Yes. Because I saw several hands coming up. No? Yes.
Why did John do all that research about the flogging? Not to be punny, but it seems rather morbid to me.
Well, I don't know. They were considering it, I guess, at that time as a question of medical question and historical fact. I don't know. 1986, I wasn't with the Journal of American Medical, so I don't know why they did it. But they did do it, just an investigation of it to see what happened. I don't know. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
I'm not a theologian, but I wonder why all the old documents refer to what we call Jesus as Yahweh. Where was the conversion because of Yahweh to Jesus in the translation between Greek and Arabic? How did it become Jesus?
You're saying the old documents refer to God as Yahweh, and how did, in the translation, how did it get to Jesus? How did it get to Jesus?
When there's no J
Well,
translation for it.
you mean in you're talking about the Old Testament or the New Testament? The Old Testament. Yeah. Well, the Old Testament does say Yahweh. It doesn't say, yeah, it says Yahweh. It doesn't say Jesus. It's just the New Testament and the Greek in Hebrew would be Yeshua. They call him, they say Yeshua HaMashiach. Jesus our Messiah. Well, Jesus actually was probably a pretty, reasonably popular name even in the first century. It just means the one who's our security, the one who saves. Joshua would be similar name. So there would be more than one Jesus. I guess if you're Spanish, you got a lot of Jesuses anyway. So you got to specify the Jesus of Nazareth, and that's what the documents are saying. Jesus of Nazareth, the one who's the anointed one, the Christ. Messiah, or the Messiah. And there was some question over here, somebody raised, did they get them answered, or no? Any other questions? Yes.
When you were talking about the two angels and the one angel, I agree with this gentleman about the eyewitness testimony. We had a class once, and this guy ran into the room and did something and ran out. We all had to write down what happened, and if you were heavy, you thought he was thin. If you were thin, you thought he was heavy. Everybody had different things. Everybody had a sword patch.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
But we all saw something a little bit different.
Yeah.
The main act we all saw the same.
You all saw a guy run into the room and run out, yeah.
But when we saw the videotape of it, then you could really, that was a lot more accurate than our testimony. But again, if you're comparing it to these other documents that you were talking about, then I guess eyewitness testimony is, there is no video, so the eyewitness testimony has got to be the most accurate for those types of documents.
Absolutely. And what we do in the courtroom, we don't have a video for most things that happen. He stole my chicken. I did not steal his chicken. What happened? We don't have a videotape. And actually, the Watergate thing, they had to determine that by people speaking and testifying. And then they put them in prison and jail. So we do rely on eyewitness testimony. And but some things about eyewitness testimony, and that's why the legal system is developed to really sift through it and see what's accurate eyewitness testimony. And that's why the experts who really examine this will say, wow, this is really excellent eyewitness testimony. This is not the kind of thing you're talking about where they can make mistakes and you're kind of generalizing. Like if you ask me, what did I eat for dinner last Tuesday? I have trouble telling you. I might think, maybe I had pasta. I think I had pasta. If somebody says, yeah, we had pasta. Oh, yeah, we had pasta. But I might not really remember it that accurately. But if you ask my wife, Debbie, what kind of, oh, she's over here, what kind of hairs, what my hair looked like at our wedding, she's going to remember that, And so certain things, eyewitness testimony is really good for. If you're like the guy you were following for 3 years died, and you're, despondent, and what are you going to do? And he appears in the room, and he says, don't be doubting, Thomas, come feel my wounds in my side. That's something you're going to remember. So it's, some kinds of eyewitness testimony are murky, but other kinds, no, it's not. Debbie's definitely going to remember what my hairstyle was at our wedding, believe me. Even if we didn't have any pictures of the wedding and the photographer didn't take any. Anyway, so anybody else? Got some questions? These are good questions, very good questions. Yes?
What if we want to get a copy and send it to somebody who we feel would like to see who's seeking?
Yeah, a copy of what, the video or? Yeah, I think so. There's going to be a DVD, right, that we can get. I don't know, how does he get a hold of that, or how do I find out?
Contact me.
Just contact you? I'm certainly going to get a copy, I hope. See how well I did or bad I did, Yes?
No, I was going to say, I could use a copy too. I have a son who's an archaeologist, and he's saying, what he's questioning
Yeah.
I'd love to have it.
Well, what I'm going to do is I reserved this room again for May the 1st, and I'm thinking about the topic I'm going to do, but there's a lot of stuff that, we can only do so much in a shorter period of time. But I'm going to go over the prophecies next time, and I think I'm thinking about maybe touching on the archaeology. But I think I'm going to go over the prophecies, and maybe I might cover the problem of evil, because that's a big problem, the problem of evil. How can there be a good God and there be suffering and evil in the world? And it's a two-part problem. There's a rational question, is it logical, could it happen? And then there's another emotional component to it that's really powerful. So I think next time maybe, I reserved a room today, but I think I'm going to do the problem of evil and maybe on prophecy. But that would be a good thing to do archaeology. There's a lot of new archaeological discoveries that are amazing, that have really supported the Bible. And that would be a great thing to talk about. Any other questions? Yeah, Kurt?
Just that we also have confirmation by the Spirit of the Lord, which is a whole nother subject matter.
Whole nother subject matter. The gentleman talks about having confirmation that this is true by the Spirit of the Lord. And that's true, but that's not something that somebody else can evaluate or determine. So I often get in these conversations, Mormon says, I have the burning in the bosom. I know the Book of Mormon's true. And the Christian says, oh, but I have the confirmation of the Holy Spirit. And, the Buddhist says, oh, but I have such inner peace. And there's no way to determine that, because that's something that's internal, and you can know it, but I can't really see inside you and confirm it or know it. So that's why the testimony, the evidence, the facts are important. Anyway.
Someone that is of the Spirit of the Lord says that they can do something, and an example, praise for someone, just like Jesus did.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was something tangible that happened, somebody got healed, demons got delivered. That's something that's tangible evidence.
That's something that is tangible, something that you can observe, right? That is something that is tangible. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. Please invite somebody next time, somebody who's a seeker, somebody who might be interested in some of this and might have questions. Thank you.